I want to set mat1 equal to get matrix. Again, it will need to know how big to make it, how many rows and columns. So let's just arbitrarily choose 3 rows and maybe 4 columns for mat1. And for mat2, we'll say get matrix maybe 5 by 2. All right. So we have to write get matrix, a method down below in this class. I know it's in this class because we're not using an object and the dot operator to get to it. I'm not saying like m1.getMatrix or something like that. It's just get matrix, so I know it's in this class. So public static. What's it going to return? It's going to return a value for mat1, and mat1 is an int matrix. So it's our first time doing this. The return type is int and 2 pair of square brackets. The name is get matrix. And what's it get? An int that stands for the rows and an int that stands for the columns. So to do it safely, probably most of you might do this. A matrix called mat of type int equals new int, and the size is rows by columns. And then return it. So that's a lot there, isn't it? That method right there is our first time returning a matrix. And so it means our first time with a return statement of a matrix and also the return value up there in the signature line. Okay. Now, I think it's probable that most of my kids that are heading to 5s, which is hopefully a lot of you out there, might do this in a single statement. You could just do what? You could do return new int rows calls. Does that work? Let's compile it and see. It seems to work. Okay, so returning an anonymous matrix. So we got it instantiated. What's inside it? Remember the default value for matrices and arrays, at least default int values, right, is 0, right? So we got a bunch of zeros in these. Well, let's see them. Let's print these guys out. Let's just make a print method and send it mat1, and then we'll send it mat2. What's up? Yeah. Okay. Now this one's not going to return anything, right? You can tell from the main line that calls them. There's no like mat equals this or anything. It's not going to return anything. It's going to be void methods instead. And what's the parameter? Well, up here we passed it an int matrix. The AP exam will usually call it mat. I don't mind if you call it M, but the more comfortable you are with the AP exam, the chances are the better you'll do. So maybe get used to calling it mat. And so what do you want to do? You want to display all the values inside these matrices. They're all zeros, but we'll change them soon. Now, you'll see several nested loops on the AP exam. and probably close to half of them will deal with matrices. There'll be one or two that are rectangles or triangles, and maybe 2 or 3 that do something mathematical, calculate something. But there'll be 3 or 4, at least, that traverse through, that loop through, that iterate through matrices. And they all look like this. An outside loop, an inside loop, and then something with our matrix inside. The outside loop is going to loop through the rows. The inside loop is going to loop through the columns. Just like a loop through an array goes from position 0 out to length minus 1, just like a loop that goes through an array goes from 0 out to length minus 1, that's what the outside loop of a matrix does. Outside loop that goes through a matrix does. Okay. I wish you would use explicit names for your variables. Don't use I or J or K or X or Y here. Use R or row. Start at 0, go out to less than mat.length. Recall from yesterday's handout, mat.length is the number of rows in mat. And then row plus plus. You're going to use that same exact outside loop, I don't know, 50 or 60 times this semester. You're going to use it probably 3 or 4 times today. And the inside loop is the same also, the one that loops through our columns. Int col equals 0. Now, how do you find the number of columns? Well, we'll think about that for a second and pause maybe. This is not quite right. For the body of the nested loop, we'll display whatever's at position row col. And that's not very nice either, but we'll start there. Now, this is not right. And I cannot tell you how many times I've seen kids do this with arrays. Try and do something like length on an array and use empty brackets. It's wrong there and it's wrong here. This does not even compile. Okay? You have to give it a row to find the length of. Now, on the AP exam, the curriculum says that all the matrices are rectangular. That means they're not jagged like yesterday's handout, right? Yesterday's handout we did together in class and the hour yesterday. I think row 0 had 6 values, row 1 had 7 values, and row 2, I believe, had 5 values, something like that. But they were different, weren't they? Because it was called a jagged matrix. But on the AP exam, it's rectangular. Every row will have the same length. Every row will have the same number of columns. So I could put a 0 there, because whatever the length of row 0 is, that's also the length of row 1 and row 2 and on up to length minus 1 row. Now, most of you, believe it or not, will take a class in college in which you program some more. And in those classes, you're probably not going to be promised that the matrices are rectangular. So what you'll do in that case is put row there. Whatever row you're on, you see it? whatever row you're on, that's the length you want. So that's how you'd have to loop through a jagged matrix, where the length of each row might be different, like in last night's handout. But now this should compile. Yeah, it compiles, and I can run it. Again, the top matrix is 3 by 4, and the second one is 5 by 2. And I called the print method. Did you call your print method? Right there. And now I run it, and I want to see eventually a 3 by 4 matrix of zeros and a 5 by 2 matrix of zeros. But what I have so far is just a bunch of zeros. A good quiz question tomorrow or Friday might be, how many zeros will you see? How many is that on my screen? Well, the number of zeros in Mat 1, which is 3 by 4, is 12, right? 3 rows, 4 columns, that's 12 zeros. Mat 2 is going to have 10 zeros. So on my screen, I got 22 zeros. Now, of course, I want these guys to be shaped like a matrix. So let's go to the next line after each row with an out.println line after the inside loop. Now it'll look a little better, I think. Let's try that. Okay, it's sort of looking better. I got 4 columns, 3 rows in the first one, 2 columns, 5 rows in the second one. I'd recommend putting a space between them or a tab between them, because they're not going to be zeros for much longer. We're going to put numbers in there. And so I'll put a tab. If you want, you can put a space. And now it's a little more legible. Okay. Maybe put a print line after our first print call. Could I do this? Put a new line character? No, couldn't do that. I couldn't put it there. No. All right.